schizophrenia is a disease which is common to science.
That's right. Jesus was a schizophrenic. And so were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were all a bunch of schizophrenics. How on earth can you read the Gospels, the teachings of Christ, and conclude that the guy had mental problems? How on earth can you read the Sermon on the Mount and conclude that Jesus had mental problems? Come on.
Cliffe is confronted by a group of atheist students who ask him hard questions concerning Jesus' resurrection. They contend that the resurrection is an illusion and challenge Jesus' sanity. We'll look at the trustworthiness of the gospel stories, the medical evidence in the Gospel of John, and the disciples' motivations. We'll tackle big subjects like how to authenticate the resurrection and why the narratives of Jesus' disciples are credible. Let's see if the students' arguments hold up or if they eventually fail to disprove the resurrection.
We cannot verify, we're talking about dead man rising from the grave. So,
Learn it from someone.
If you're talking about someone who believes that happened, how can you know that was actually the truth? Say somebody tells me David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear. They saw it, they believe it. How can they convince me, who didn't see it, that happened?
Right. Well, what you do is you look them in the face and you start asking why. And you don't stop asking why. You just keep on asking, why do you believe that? What is the evidence that you believe, that what you believe is true? And you seek to understand what led that person to that. All right, well, if it's regard to David Copperfield, we can go out and talk with David Copperfield. And we can figure out, what's David Copperfield into? And did he really make the Statue of Liberty disappear, or didn't he? Is he a magician, or did he really make the thing disappear? Was it an illusion, or was it reality?
What are we talking about with the resurrection? Is it an illusion or is it reality? How can you say that it's reality if it's somebody's account? I mean, how can you take their word as a believer in this event? How can you take their word to be absolute truth of the historic event rather than believing in something that they saw and that they believe in?
Well, you push it back and you go to the source documents, the Gospels. And you ask, okay, I'm going to read these things skeptically. I'm going to ask, first of all, did Christ really die? Now, the interesting thing is the Gospel of John records an interesting tidbit of information. The Gospel of John records that a Roman soldier stuck a spear in the side of Christ, and an issue of watery serum, separate from clotted blood, flowed from his side. Well, they didn't understand that medically in the first century, but we understand medically today that that's a sign of death. Massive heart failure, clotting of the arteries. The guy was dead. He just didn't lapse into unconsciousness and resuscitate, in other words. Then we read, they took his body off the cross, put it in a tomb, and they set a Roman guard to make sure that nobody would steal his body. Now, the disciples were not expecting him to rise from the dead. They were scared, they didn't understand, and they were deserting Christ. But 3 days after he dies, he appears risen from the dead, first of all, to some grief-torn women. Now, I'm impressed with that, because a first-century Jewish male would never have a Jewish woman be his eyewitness in order to gain credibility, because sexism was pathetic in that culture, and women were viewed as chattel. It was horrible. But the record is, Christ first appeared to some grief-torn women. Then he appeared to the apostles. But there was one guy who could have been on the faculty here at UT. His name was Thomas. And he said, not unless I can see Christ with my own eyes, not unless I can take my hand and thrust in the spoon in his side, will I believe. And one night all the disciples are together. Thomas is there. Suddenly Christ stands among them, walks right up to Thomas and says, my man right here, take your hands, put in the nail prints in my hands, take your hand and thrust in the spoon in my side. And Thomas stopped doubting and believed. Then in 1 Corinthians 15, written in 50, 51, 52 AD, the Apostle Paul quotes a hymn, a creed, that Christ died for our sins, was buried, rose from the dead, appeared to the apostles, to James, and to over 500 people who saw him risen from the dead, most of whom are still living. And you see that the resurrection of Christ was not made up by a church that was trying to increase its adherents. Right from the get-go, the resurrection of Christ was at the center of the message of these followers of Christ. We have seen this man risen from the dead. Then, one after another, they stood before Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers said, acknowledge Caesar as Lord and live. or else maintain that Jesus is Lord and we'll kill you. And every single one of them said, I have seen Jesus risen from the dead, and they died, not for a belief. They died for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. Psychology shows you, people will not die to cover up what they know to be a lie. People will die for a lie, convinced it's true. But these guys died claiming we saw Jesus risen from the dead, he is Lord. Which means if they didn't see him, they were lying.
But this isn't in the Roman writings. There's no record of this slaughter.
Eusebius records it wonderfully.
Schizophrenia is a disease which is common to science.
That's right. Jesus was a schizophrenic. And so were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were all a bunch of schizophrenics. How on earth can you read the Gospels, the teachings of Christ, and conclude that the guy had mental problems? How on earth can you read the Sermon on the Mount and conclude that Jesus had mental problems? Come on.
To understand if Jesus rose from the dead, evaluate the facts and motivations of those who claimed it. The disciples and New Testament writers have nothing to gain by creating this account. They were persecuted, suffered, and died for their convictions. Why would they go through such difficulty if the resurrection was a lie? People are unlikely to die for something they know to be wrong, especially if it provides no money or social rewards. In 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, Paul writes about Jesus' resurrection and mentions that he appeared to over 500 people at once, many of whom were still alive when Paul wrote this letter. This means that those who doubted could verify these accounts with living witnesses. This is not akin to a magician's trick, as magic tricks are designed to deceive and entertain, not to inspire enduring, sacrificial faith. Concerning the notion that the resurrection is an illusion, observe the disciples' transformation. Before the resurrection, they were terrified and fled. John 20:19. After seeing the resurrected Christ, they boldly preached the faith. Acts 2:14-36. This tremendous shift indicates that they truly experienced the risen Jesus, as individuals do not often drastically modify their life and gladly risk death for something they know to be a fake. Additionally, the resurrection was prophesied in the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New Testament. Psalm 16:10 says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." This is echoed in Acts 2:31, where Peter explains that David foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of Christ. The resurrection is not a delusion. It is a reality attested by numerous eyewitness reports, fulfilled prophecies, and the disciples' lives being transformed. The facts, as well as the disciples' willingness to suffer and die for their trust in the risen Jesus, clearly suggest that the resurrection is neither a delusion or a hoax.
How can
His
you prove?
resurrection,
When
that's
was the last time you saw a resurrection of
When was
anybody?
the last time I never have seen resurrections.
Exactly. Can you? I mean, have you ever seen any kind of a phenomenon like that before?
No.
No. I mean, so how can you believe something like that?
Because
Yes, you
first
can
of all,
believe. I mean,
the
somebody
evidence is
dying.
that a supernatural God exists, and because a supernatural God exists, he is totally capable of performing a miracle.
So you've seen God, basically.
No, I've seen evidence that God exists.
Like what? What
Order and
evidence?
design of the cosmos, life coming from life, not from non-life, moral absolutes pointing us to the fact that there's more to reality than matter and energy,
How can-
free
you can't-
will.
But I'm sure you can. All right, unless you can you prove that we even exist?
Sir, I can't even prove we're having this conversation.
Exactly, exactly. So I mean, when you start talking about all these different things, and what you're basically talking about is whose rhetoric is stronger, and then
No.
you would follow that.
No, sir. No, sir. Right here. I can't prove to you sitting here. It is not an issue of rhetoric, whether I stop my hand right there. It is an issue of evidence. The evidence is he is sitting here. That's why I don't keep swinging through his handsome face. Has nothing to do with rhetoric. Has to do with evidence that the guy's sitting here. I base my life on evidence. I can't prove to you he's there, but boy, the evidence of my eyesight is he is there. Therefore, I stop when his face begins.
But where's the evidence of resurrection?
That's historical evidence. The historical evidence found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that the guy really died on a cross, was really buried, and 3 days later really came alive again.
And that's exactly what I'm saying. Is that's rhetoric. I'm not saying that.
What do you mean that's rhetoric? It is words, yes, well, you do agree on that.
Right, and I'm saying that to prove something, in order for them to prove something, they would have to say all these things, and they're doing exactly that.
We already
And
agreed
I'm not
upon the
saying
fact
that
we
they
can't
didn't
prove
believe it.
anything. So
And I
don't
didn't
use
say-
proof. I
I
can't use proof.
Okay, but I'm
Evidence.
talking about evidence that they're saying, and well, I'm saying proof because that's what they're using. Because I'm saying that they're using rhetoric for people to believe in these things, and to believe in Jesus, and belief is irrational. So I mean, it could be.
No, belief is not irrational. It doesn't have to be irrational. It can be irrational. But if your belief is based on solid evidence, that's not an irrational belief.
But then it's not belief.
Yes, it is belief.
I mean, if it's solid evidence, then it's concrete. I mean, there's no belief in it.
Prove to me the University of Texas is going to grant you a diploma on your day of graduation. Prove to me UT's not going to say, hey, let's break tradition, no diplomas this year. It is possible.
Prove to me that you're going to get to heaven even if you do all the things that
I can't
Bible
prove
says.
it.
Then there we go. So that's rhetoric.
But there's evidence that UT is a reliable institution of higher learning. Based on that evidence, you pay a big tuition, you study hard to get a diploma. That's belief.
Yep.
And that belief is based on evidence. You don't prove UT is going to give you a diploma. The evidence is, if you complete the course of study, if you pay your tuition, they'll give you a diploma. Sir, you have belief. Prove to me your roommate's not going to stick a knife in your back tonight. You can't prove it. Prove to me that your closest friend is not going to stick a knife in your back tomorrow.
I can't.
Exactly.
And I don't have a belief in that, though.
You don't.
I'm certainly, I expect anybody to stab me in the back. True, yes. And I'm from New York, too, so I'm sure you believe that, too, right?
Well, I think...
Or you know that, I should say.
Although I cannot prove to you that my best friend is not going to stick a knife in my back, there's a lot of evidence that my best friend is not going to stick a knife in my back. That's why when I see my best friend on Wednesday, I'm not going to check her pockets and purse to find out if she got a knife in there.
Okay.
That's belief, sir.
Believing in the resurrection of Jesus, despite never having witnessed such an event personally, can be challenging. Yet, understanding the evidence and rationale behind this belief can help bridge that gap. To begin with, let's address the skepticism about the New Testament's credibility and the claim that it might be biased. First, it's essential to acknowledge that many historical figures and events are known through the accounts of their followers or contemporaries. Take Socrates, for instance. We don't have any written works from Socrates himself, but we know about his philosophy through the writings of his students, such as Plato and Xenophon. Similarly, the New Testament was written by people who were close to Jesus, making them primary sources. Discrediting their accounts solely because they were his followers is flawed reasoning. If we applied this logic consistently, we would have to dismiss much of what we know about other historical figures. The disciples and other writers of the New Testament had no material or social incentives to fabricate the resurrection story. They faced persecution, suffering, and death for their beliefs. History tells us that people do not willingly die for something they know to be a lie, especially when it brings no tangible benefits. In 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, Paul lists multiple appearances of the risen Jesus, including an instance where over 500 people saw him at once, many of whom were still alive when Paul wrote his letter. This allows for cross-verification with living witnesses at that time. Now, addressing the question of believing in a resurrection without having seen anything similar before. Belief in the resurrection is not based on personal experience alone, but on the convergence of several factors, including historical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and the profound transformation it brought to those who witnessed it. The New Testament provides detailed accounts of Jesus' resurrection. In Luke 24:36-43, Jesus appears to his disciples and asks for something to eat, demonstrating he is not a ghost but has a physical body. In John 20:24-29, Thomas, one of the disciples, initially doubts the resurrection. He demands to see and touch Jesus' wounds before believing. When Jesus appears and invites Thomas to do so, Thomas exclaims, "My Lord and my God." This episode shows that even the disciples needed tangible evidence to believe, just as skeptics today seek. Moreover, the resurrection was not a concept invented by the early church. It was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. For example, Psalm 16:10 states, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." This is echoed in Acts 2:31, where Peter explains that David foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ. The argument that the New Testament writers were biased is countered by the principle that followers of any significant figure or movement are often the best sources of information about them. Those who were closest to Jesus were in the best position to document his life and teachings. Seeking evidence of Jesus outside of the Bible often stems from a desire to find sources that discredit him rather than objectively prove or disprove his existence. In the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, Luke 16:19-31, Jesus illustrates that even if someone were to rise from the dead, those who do not want to believe will find reasons not to. The rich man in hell asks for Lazarus to be sent back to warn his brothers, but Abraham replies, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead." This parable highlights that disbelief is often rooted in the will, not the lack of evidence. Finally, consider the transformative power of the resurrection. The disciples, who were once fearful and in hiding, John 20:19, became bold proclaimers of the gospel after witnessing the risen Christ, Acts 2:14-36. This radical change suggests a genuine encounter with the risen Jesus, as such transformation is unlikely if based on a fabricated event. In conclusion, belief in the resurrection is supported by credible historical evidence, eyewitness testimonies, and the profound impact it had on the early followers of Jesus. Discrediting the New Testament because it was written by Jesus' followers is illogical and inconsistent with how we treat other historical documents. The resurrection stands as a cornerstone of Christian faith, not because it is a repeated natural event, but because of the unique and compelling evidence surrounding it.